Hello, and welcome to Rejected Religion Spotlight. My guest today is Dr. Korshi Dosoo from the Julius Maximilian University of Würzburg, Germany. Korshi is the junior team leader of the project called the Coptic Magical Papyri, Vernacular Religion in Late Roman and Early Islamic Egypt, and he's joined me today to talk about ancient magical papyri and their modern reception. Thank you for joining me today, Korshi.
Thank you, Stephanie. I'm very happy to be here.
Very, very nice to talk to you today. Before we get started, for the listeners and the viewers out there, I am dealing with a very bad case of hay fever at the moment. So I apologize for my stuffy nose and my scratchy voice, and I hope it won't be too distracting. Now, Korshi, you were recently invited to the University of Amsterdam to give a lecture there. And because of that, I was also introduced to your work through my association with the HHP Center at the university. And I have to say, I was not very familiar with the topic of ancient magical papyri, as my specialties are found more in contemporary esotericism. However, in reading the literature that you provided for me, I have to say I find this to be quite a fascinating topic, but probably one that is not very well known in the mainstream public. So I'd like to ask if you could start by explaining what magical papyri are, where they came from, and what they were used for.
Yeah, of course. So perhaps we should start with what a papyrus is. I mean, I think most people have some idea.
I think
of
so.
Course,
yeah.
Okay, so it's a kind of paper, right, from
Yeah.
the ancient world, made with a reed which grows in Egypt and in a few other places. And perhaps when most people think about papyri, they imagine, ancient Egyptian documents like the Book of the Dead. So with the famous drawings of Anubis weighing the heart and so on. So those are very old papyri from the Pharaonic period. But papyrus continued to be used in Egypt until about the 10th century. So we have papyri from Egypt until about the 10th century. And throughout most of this period, papyrus is also being used elsewhere in the Mediterranean and the Roman world. So actually, there's some very nice examples of papyri from France, for example. So the French kings, until the Islamic conquest made Egypt unavailable, the French kings, for example, would import papyrus and they would write upon it. So papyrus is really just the normal writing surface for much of Europe and North Africa and so on for thousands of years, really, until it was overtaken by parchment and then paper. So magical papyri, a particular type of papyri. So we have all kinds of documents written on papyri, legal documents, mathematical texts, letters, and so on. But specifically, when you talk about magical papyri, we're often talking about the ones written in Greek, written in two forms of the Egyptian language, the two kind of latest forms, which are called Demotic and Coptic. And maybe I should quickly explain that quickly as well. So the Egyptian language, most people are probably familiar with hieroglyphs. Right, so this is how the Egyptian language is written for a lot of its history. But over time, the hieroglyphs became more and more cursive. If you're writing on papyrus with a brush, it's easier to kind of write them in more flowing strokes. And so the latest form of the Egyptian language, which was used from the first millennium BC until about the latest documents we have are about the 5th century CE. These are written in a form called Demotic, which is a bit different in terms of its grammar and it's very beautiful, looks a little bit like Arabic, perhaps, if you aren't familiar with it. That was then replaced by an even later stage of the Egyptian language called Coptic. So it's still the same language, just in later form. And that is written primarily in Greek characters. They added a few extra signs for sounds that didn't exist in Greek. And the document behind me, for example, is written in Coptic. And this language is mainly used by the Christian church in Egypt, the Coptic church, which is where the name comes from. Okay, so let's get back to magical papyri. So around the 1st century BC, we start finding these documents written in Greek, but also written a little bit in Demotic and a bit in Coptic, which contain what scholars from the 19th century onwards started calling magical texts. Of course, we get, ancient Egyptian magical texts, We get, magical texts from Babylonia and so on. But the ones that we start to find around the 1st century BC, and these continue being written in Greek in Egypt until about the 7th century in Greek. And we have even later ones in Coptic until about the 12th century, although they're actually not written on papyrus anymore. They're written on paper, but we still call them papyri because papyrologists are strange like that. So these documents are perhaps more similar to what your listeners might know as the kind of Western magical tradition, the kind of tradition of ceremonial magic. So you have things like, invocations of deities, similar to later invocations of angels and demons to kind of appear and answer questions or serve as familiar spirits. You have love spells, spells to force a man or woman, but usually a woman, to kind of come to you and do whatever you want, let them do whatever you want to them. You have curses, which are meant to kind of make people sick or destroy them. You have amulets. So we have a lot of documents that are meant to kind of help you. They give you instructions for carrying out these rituals, so similar to the grimoires, for example, that you find in the medieval tradition. Often very similar. We sometimes even find kind of echoes of the same rituals in the medieval tradition, in Latin and Greek and Arabic and so on. So these languages are used for magic in the Middle Ages. But we also find what I and others who work in this call applied texts. These are texts which are actually produced by these rituals. And these are things like amulets or curses, which have specific people's names written on them. And then, if it's an amulet, you wear it to protect you. If it's a curse, you bury it somewhere. And these documents started appearing at the same time as other papyri started appearing. So in the 19th century, sorry if I'm going into too much detail, but in the 19th century, Egypt kind of underwent a bit of a revolution. It started industrializing under the reign of Muhammad Ali. Europeans started becoming more involved in Egypt. And these two things end up producing the antiquities trade, of which the papyrus trade was part. So with the kind of expansion of agriculture in Egypt into marginal land, you often had Egyptian farmers going into the remains of ancient sites. And as they were digging for fertilizer, they would often find papyri, and these would then find their way to the European market. But also because there were a lot more Europeans who had a lot of money and were becoming increasingly interested in ancient artifacts, including papyri. A lot of Egyptians actually decided themselves they would go out, to tombs and temples. They knew where these places were. There had been, in some extent, a treasure hunting profession for centuries by that period. So actually, the majority of the very nice examples of magical papyri we have come from that kind of context of Egyptians going out to tombs and temples primarily, or other ancient sites, finding documents perhaps in jars or in boxes where they've been stored for hundreds or thousands of years, and then through a series of middlemen selling them to people, selling them to Europeans, and they would then find their way into European or American or even Australasian collections. Of course, there are still papyri being found in Egypt today, including magical papyri, through excavation. But the majority of the large and famous ones are kind of found through this more informal process of these illicit finds. We have some very interesting cases of magical papyri being found in controlled excavations in various parts of Egypt, but that's generally the exception. So I hope that's an okay introduction to the documents.
Yes.
Perhaps you could let me know if there's anything that I've missed out.
No, not at all. Thank you for explaining that. That puts it in a better context, so people understand how Europeans came to know about these papyri and these texts. How would people in the time itself, how would people obtain these magical texts? I mean, was this something that was common and out in the open, so to speak, or was there a certain amount of secrecy involved?
To be honest, when we study these documents, there's a huge number of unanswered questions. And even when we have answers, or we can propose answers, they're often very controversial. So I think this is even the case for, the Middle Ages, where we have a lot more information. Occasionally for the Middle Ages, we even have the names of copyists and owners. And yet we still, I don't think, have the full picture. And it's even more serious for the ancient world. The texts that we're looking at, if they're applied texts, they might have personal names. If they are lists of recipes, what I call formularies, they typically don't have any information about their owner. So we have to kind of do a lot of guesswork, really. In terms of what we can perhaps reconstruct based on looking at the papyri and based on looking at literary evidence, we think that generally it was something fairly secretive to some extent. So in the papyri themselves, there's a discourse of secrecy. Do not tell anybody else about this. Do not share it with anyone. But of course, as your listeners might know, this is a very popular trope in kind of occult literature generally, right? Like there's a kind of trope of secrecy, which makes something seem more attractive. So that is to say that perhaps all people might have known about these kinds of practices and known who to go to, and maybe even been able, there may have been some kind of market in these books. It's a bit hard to say. We actually don't know a huge amount about the book market in antiquity in general. So there may have been some kind of trade, for example. But generally speaking, when we find these mentioned, it seems to be in somewhat secretive contexts. So, for example, there are literary stories of people having magical books but hiding them. I should probably say that a lot of the information, the kind of rich information we have, comes from a period in which the Roman Empire is becoming Christian. And so this is a kind of a complex academic or debate within academia about the legal status of magic within the Roman Empire. But there were some Roman laws against what came to be called magic from quite early on, so from the Republican period, but especially in the early centuries of our era, which is more or less when Egypt was becoming part of the Roman Empire. There were an increasing number of laws which could be used to control practitioners of magic. So early on, it focused on things like curses, which were referred to often by using the same terminology as poisoning. So poisoning and cursing were often not distinguished, and that was illegal. Divination was often considered illicit, and not only magical divination by summoning, spirits, but also astrology, because it was seen perhaps as something which could threaten an emperor, for example. If an emperor was foretold to be overthrown, then this could be seen as perhaps inciting a revolt or encouraging a revolt. And then from around the 3rd century onwards, we get very explicit laws against any kind of magic, so any kinds of magical practices. By the time of Constantine, this includes explicitly healing practices. So the kind of legal status of magic is one reason why people might have been secretive, but there's a discourse of secrecy earlier than that. It's not something that shows up in documentary texts very often, for example. So when we read letters, people don't generally talk about magic. There are hundreds and thousands of letters preserved from the ancient world. Very, very, very few of them mention anything which we could talk about, we could consider close to magic. So it seems that there's some kind of perhaps taboo about discussing it openly. And there's an interesting case of similar things being observed in modern Ethiopia. There's a French anthropologist called Siena de Menonville who studied this in Ethiopia, and who mentions that there's a case in modern Ethiopia of everybody knowing about magic, knowing that it's practiced, knowing the kinds of practices that take place, knowing who to go to, but not really being comfortable discussing it in public. And I get the impression that something similar may have been the case in the ancient world, in late antiquity. So where we do encounter it, it's usually kind of in hagiographical stories or very lurid fictional stories. So that's kind of a safe place to discuss magic. And that makes it a bit difficult for us as historians to get a sense of its real position in everyday life.
I see. This is a very tricky area, regardless. When you're talking about magic, it's not a cut and dry thing. So my next question is maybe a bit mean for you, but because I do understand the complexity of the topic of magic. But if you could talk a little bit about your findings, your research findings, as to how ancient people thought about magic. Is this concept of magic that was understood in ancient times the same as we might understand it today in popular culture, for example?
This is a really difficult question. I think that it would depend. I think every scholar of ancient magic who you ask would probably answer it a bit differently. So I should probably say that my answer is very much my answer, and other people may disagree very strongly with
Understood.
me. To be honest, I find this very hard to answer, I suppose, even putting that aside, because I've been working on this material for so long that I feel like I can't really separate my understanding of magic from what these texts are. And so I'm always kind of fascinated when I talk to people who don't really know this material as well as I do. What do they think of as magic, you know? So I suppose there's lots of ways to answer this question. I'll maybe come to another one. One thing that struck me recently is that I think in kind of modern discourse, so there's maybe something that goes back to the 19th century, people like the Golden Dawn. I think magic is very much a kind of, well, perhaps there's two things I could say about modern conceptions of magic. One is coming from Fraser, and obviously it's a bit older than that, but Fraser's the one who popularized it, is the idea of magic as mechanical, right?
Right.
So it's a kind of force of nature, which is kind of in some way hidden, but which can be manipulated. And I think you see this in kind of modern fiction in terms of, magic as kind of a science which can be discovered and then mastered. And I think this, obviously you can link that back to, like Renaissance natural magic. And there are some examples in the magical papyri. So maybe that's one concept of magic that we can identify in the modern world. So magic as a force. Another thing which I've noticed in modern discourses of magic is magic as kind of self-empowerment. It's the idea that by becoming a magician, you self-actualize and you have this tremendous force inside yourself, which you can then use to change the world around you. And I think that's kind of one of the definitions of magic used by modern practitioners, if I'm not mistaken, coming from Crowley, the idea that magic is about affecting change in the world.
Yes.
So my impression is if we could kind of compare that to ancient magic, magic in the sense that we encounter it in magical papyri, and leaving aside the question of whether people in the ancient world would call it magic, that's a slightly different question. But ancient magic is very much, to me at least, relational. So it's not about I am a very powerful person manipulating forces. Rather, it's about I know the right way in which to petition this higher being in order for that being to help me and to arrange the forces of nature in a slightly different way. So it's less about the individual affecting change, I would say, and more about the individual within this kind of network of relationships. And that way it's very similar to the way in which people would have experienced their social world. So if there's something you need, you go to a powerful person, you explain the problem that you have, you explain the reason that you need their help and that they should help you. You'd say, well, for example, I'm your client, I've done X and Y for you. Use special linguistic formulae. So you might say, oh, I invoke you to do this by Zeus, the god who protects travelers, or I call upon you by the merciful Virgin Mary. In a Christian context. And you find similar kinds of language in the magical text. So they say, I call upon you by so-and-so, but often the thing you're calling upon is something more kind of esoteric and strange. It's kind of secret knowledge, which gives you special access to this higher power. So that's just one thing I've been reflecting on recently, this kind of relationality of magic and it being very much personal as opposed to this kind of very individualistic and very kind of mechanical sense of magic that we often have in the modern world. Apart from that, so when we talk about magic in the ancient world, emic concepts of magic, there's this kind of range of terms. We have magia, which is where the word magic comes from. It comes from magike techne, so magical technique or magical art, something like that. There's other terms like goetia. This was an older term which originally was to do with practices relating to the dead. It may have originally meant something like songs spoken to the dead, but quite quickly by the classical period, it becomes about invoking the dead, for example, for curses or for necromancy. This is a concept which is quite similar to magia. So magia was often considered a kind of newer word which replaced goetia, but it was much more negatively charged. So in some of the magical papyri, they do describe themselves as practicing magia. They do describe their own practice of magia, but they never describe their own practice as goetia. And so goetia is more of kind of an outsider term, which in vernacular languages of Europe is often translated as black magic. So my impression is that magia kind of referred to this kind of range of techniques which were associated with kind of secret knowledge, and in particular Eastern priests. So the term literally means something like the art of the magoi, so the art of these Persian or more broadly Mesopotamian priests, and magos is actually sometimes extended to Egyptian priests as well. So I guess magic in the ancient world kind of referred to a range of secret techniques which wise men of the past and of the East had taught, and which could be found in certain books. But there's also this kind of more pejorative sense of magic. So basically anybody who's doing anything which seems kind of anybody who's showing kind of surprising power could be called a magician, and this could then be used as a kind of negative characterization of them. So this is a very common trope with kind of miracle workers like Apollonius of Tyana or Jesus. There's extensive discourse in late antiquity of these people being called magoi. And the interesting thing is that people in the ancient world were aware of this. So a very common trope in Christian hagiographies is that you have the saint who's performing miracles. He gets called before the governor, and the governor says, "You're a magician." And the saint says, "Oh, I'm not really a magician. I'm doing this through the power of God." And then they have to come up with some kind of theory of what the difference between magic and miracle is. So this is a really fascinating. I mean, I find this really fascinating that you have this kind of reflexive discourse in these hagiographies, very, very early on.
But people were aware of this.
Yeah. So I think it shows they were very much aware of this kind of discursive use of magic. But at the same time, the Christian position is not to deny that magic existed. It's to try to construct a clear differentiation between their practices and magic.
I see. My platform pays a lot of attention to how esoteric thought, even ancient thought, can be filtered through history, and how it is received in a contemporary, I guess, jacket, if you want to say. The term that I like to use for that is a culture. Mm-hmm. When I was reading your texts about amulets, about spells, love spells, I'm calling it spells, but I'm thinking, and I don't know if I'm making the association a proper association, but I'm wondering if these types of ideas have kind of filtered through all the centuries, and we see things like that today in our contemporary ideas of what magic could be, in things that we see, read, and hear about voodoo or New Age practices that you're using special oils, or you're using special crystals, or you're using something that is helping you to gain something that you desire, whatever this may be. And different systems are using different practices for that. But it seems like there's some kind of connection there. Am I making a erroneous connection, or do you think that there might be something behind that way of thinking?
So kind of once again, the answer that you get is going to depend on who you ask.
Okay, your opinion.
Yeah. So I mean, the way so I'm saying that to kind of set up the point. So I think, as you know, there's been a big move away from the term magic in academia. So this is if you I don't know if you've interviewed Bernd Christianotto or if you know his work. Yes. He talks about the Zerfall de Magie. So the idea that there's the concept of magic went through this collapse. I think almost immediately after Fraser starts using it, you have anthropologists criticizing it. But I think particularly between the 60s and the 80s is when kind of people working on ancient magic kind of absorbed this idea. So one way in which they've reacted to this is to try to avoid big narratives which would link ancient magic to the present, and even really avoid the concept of using the concept of magic in a larger way. So really, when scholars of ancient magic talk about magic, very often they're really just talking about magical papyri or defecciones, and there's kind of a resistance to linking it to later periods, because the more you do that, the more the concept of magic becomes important. But this is something which I disagree with, so perhaps I can respond to it a little bit. I think that my impression is there is really a continuity between these practices and our modern conception of magic. And we can see this in things like vocabulary. So, for example, one term you use for a love spell, particularly a love spell you give someone in the form of a drink, is filtron in the magical papyri. And of course, this becomes filter with a PH. And this is a term very commonly used for magical drinks, magic potions throughout the Middle Ages. I mean, it's a bit, I don't think people really talk about it now. I suspect you may find it in Harry Potter. So it's a slightly archaic word, but until very recently it was used. And so there are lots of continuities in terms of the language used. And even in terms of practice, so, you have names like abracadabra, which we can link to abrasax, for example, which is a very common name in these ancient texts. So I think there's a real continuity. Of course, there's a lot of changes. So there's a huge amount of transformation of these practices that goes on as they're transferred through time and through different places. So I do think there is continuity. I think that we, of course, have to be careful that we, or at least I as a scholar, want to be careful to not perhaps fall into this kind of Fraserian trap of assuming that magic is just kind of something that the human brain automatically does. Or if you do assume that, perhaps you have to have a slightly different definition of magic. Perhaps it's something broader or even something narrower than what I'm talking about here, which is this kind of specific range of practices. But the voodoo doll is actually a very interesting example because I don't know if you've seen, but you have lots of very interesting examples from the ancient world, from ancient Egypt and even older. There's a very famous example. If you Google Louvre, so the Louvre in France, voodoo doll, you'll see a very interesting case of a woman who can be we can kind of identify the rough period she's from based on her hairstyle, which is very kind of characteristic. Romans had a very kind of predictable patterns of fashion. So by comparing it to statues, you can kind of get a sense where it's from. And she's basically stabbed with a number of nails in various parts of her body. So her eyes, her brain, her genitals, her heart. And this is a very interesting object because we can connect it to a text which talks about how by stabbing her in these particular places, you're controlling the function of these organs and you're basically preventing her from thinking about or having sexual intercourse with other people. You also find things like these figurines who are tied up or who are placed in miniature coffins and then buried often with texts or just on their own. You also find the practice of melting these dolls. So we find, obviously we don't have any examples if they're melted, but in text they describe, if they're made of wax, you melt them or you might burn them in a fire. And what's interesting is that, if you ask someone how a voodoo doll works nowadays, they'll say that you make a figure of someone, you stick a bit of hair in it, and you stab it, and they feel pain in that body part. But that's not necessarily how the voodoo doll was traditionally thought to work, right? It was more about, and so first of all, putting the hair in the doll, this is something which does definitely come from these ancient magical papyri. It's called, so you very often take something which is connected to the person, so a bit of their hair or a fingernail or a bit of their clothing. And the term used in Greek is ousia, which means something like stuff or essence or something like that. So what I was getting at was these kind of manipulations of these dolls, so stabbing them with nails, burning them, putting them in coffins. These are actually tested in hoodoo practice, right? So Zora Neale Hurston, when she's writing about her investigation of hoodoo rituals, I think in the 1920s, she actually mentioned each of these specifically. She wasn't reading the magical papyri, as far as I know, so it's unlikely that I know that she was a little bit creative in her fieldwork, but I don't think that she was inventing these from whole cloth. And so you have a very interesting parallel, and actually you can then join further dots. So particularly in the 19th century, there are a lot of anthropological and folkloric accounts of people in various parts of Europe who are using dolls in very similar ways. If you go a bit further back into the Middle Ages, you can find accounts, of people who are being accused of witchcraft, or even in books of magic, so grimoires, you can find descriptions. So basically, you can actually trace an almost continuous line between the magical papyri and the use of what we now call voodoo dolls between, antiquity and the present. And you can even go further back to examples from ancient Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt. So, what I've just done is perhaps something which some scholars might consider a bit controversial, creating this link. But in my opinion, you can really see the steps almost every part of the way. But then this raises interesting problem of why we call them voodoo dolls, because they're not really, there's actually not really any meaningful connection to Haitian voodoo. There's maybe a little bit of a connection to voodoo in a slightly older sense. So voodoo was kind of one of the terms used in the Americas for African-American folk magic, so what's often called the Conjuring Tradition, or more often nowadays hoodoo. My impression, I did a little bit of work on this for an article which isn't out yet. The term voodoo doll seems to have started to be used around the time of the US occupation of Haiti. So it seems at this time there's kind of an obsession in the US with Haiti and with voodoo, and with this also when like zombies, for example, start appearing in American literature. So my impression is that around the same time, probably in the decades preceding it, this is when there's a rise in interest in folklore. You have people like Fraser, and even Sigmund Freud talking about the voodoo doll, but not calling it a voodoo doll. They talk about these figures which are stabbed with nails, and they connect it to, for example, Scotland or Hungary or German peasants. And my impression is that for whatever reason in America in the late teens and early 20s, this kind of interest in Haiti and the concept of this doll, which is kind of thought of as a primitive artifact, got linked together to create this concept of the voodoo doll, even though it's a practice which has very long attestation in Europe and North Africa, used by people who are Christians or Muslims and people we now call pagans. So that's one practice which is very specific and can perhaps be traced for quite a long period of time. There are perhaps others that we could talk about, but we don't really have time for that, I imagine.
Well, thank you for explaining that. I mean, I think that's really an interesting link to be made with that. I mean, I'm expanding my own knowledge base here as I'm listening to you talk about this. So thank you for sharing that. I find this to be very interesting, and also that you mentioned Harry Potter. I mean, I wasn't even thinking of that when I asked the question, but yeah, I mean, this concept that people, not scholars, but just the layperson has about magic. It's very interesting how these ideas travel throughout history. So, if we stay with the modern times, in your dissertation called Rituals of Apparition in the Theban Magical Library, you discuss that a collection of magical papyri known as the Theban Magical Library was dispersed throughout Europe and Great Britain at the end of the 19th century. And you mentioned that before when you were talking about how Europeans came to know of these texts. Members of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, you mentioned them as well, were very interested in these texts, especially the Egyptian ones. Egypt was very in vogue at that time. One of the members of the Golden Dawn used part of that text, taken from one of the papyri, that is, to create a ritual known as the Headless God or the Bornless Rite. It's called one or the other. Could you talk more about this ritual and how it became so well known and widely dispersed in the occult community? And it's still even being talked about today.
Yeah, so I mean, once again, I should preface this by saying that I'm not really an expert on this modern magic. It's just something which I'm interested in, which I've encountered in my work on the magical papyri. Yes, the Theban Magical Library, kind of most of the big famous magical papyri, which people may have encountered if they've read them, do come from this single collection, which is quite interesting in itself. These were the first ones, I think, to arrive in Europe. They're the first ones to arrive in Europe, although not all at once. They were kind of dispersed in a series of sales. So there's a group in Leiden in the Netherlands, actually not too far from Amsterdam, which were published quite early, but not completely. There were little parts published in an open letter by Caspar Roivens, who is the curator of the museum there. But then the first one to be published in full translation was a codex, so like a modern style book, but written in papyrus, which was bought by the British Museum, I think, in 1846. This is one which is now called PGM5. And this is one which contained the ritual called, it's basically, it calls upon a god called the Headless God, the Akephalos. And it's kind of a general ritual asking for protection. I should probably give the exact, yes, it's PGM5 96 to 172 if anybody wants to look it up. The text itself is called the Stela of Yeo. In its text, we don't really know what that means. Very often, these magical texts describe themselves as not very often, but sometimes describe themselves as stelae. So, if you think about like the Hermetic tradition, right, the kind of ancient Greek Hermetica, there's kind of a fiction within these texts. They were written on stelae in Egyptian by Hermes Trismegistos in the ancient past. it seems to be something similar going on here. This is a text which claims that it was a stela written by somebody called Yeo. He's called the Zographos in the text, which means painter. In the translation by Hans Dieter Betz, they translate it as hieroglyphist, but that's not really the term that you use for hieroglyphist, so it really means the painter. We don't have any idea who Yeo is. It's quite similar to Yao, so the name of the Hebrew god in Greek. And we actually find variations in Gnostic literatures that maybe this was thought to have been written by, God himself. But it's basically an invocation of a being called the Headless One, the Headless God. It has some features which are attempting to make it kind of Jewish in terms of its content. So the speaker identifies himself as Moses, for example. So this is something quite common in the magical papyri, that you identify yourself with various figures of the past or deities in order to claim power. And it's kind of asking for protection. It's asking for all the demons in the area around you to be subject to you. So it's kind of for protection against demons and so on. As you were saying, so within this order, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and actually, I guess, magic more generally in the 19th century, there was an interest in ancient cultures and in the kind of East, of course, so in India, in ancient Jewish traditions, and also with Egypt. So Egypt had for a very long time been famous as kind of the home of magic. And we find this even in the Greek magical papyri. Even though they're from Egypt, they often use this trope of Egypt as a source of knowledge. But the problem was that although in the 19th century, hieroglyphs had been decoded by Champollion, and people were starting to publish Egyptian texts, they weren't really publishing anything that was really magic as Westerners would have thought about it, right? If you read the Book of the Dead, Egyptologists often call the individual texts spells, which is, I think it's a little bit anachronistic, because really the word is just something like formula or chapter. Doesn't necessarily have the same, nuances as spell. But the Book of the Dead is basically a series of rituals for a dead person to allow them to get to the next, to a happy afterlife. It does involve some things like, for example, transformations, transforming yourself into various animals, triumphing over your enemies, for example. So in some ways it corresponds to a modern idea of magic, but not necessarily very closely. Our idea of magic is things like divination, love spells, curses. And the Book of the Dead doesn't really give you a very clear example of that. But nonetheless, some of these 19th century occultists were trying to use and adapt aspects of the Book of the Dead as magical rituals. But into this world, we then have the appearance of the Greek magical papyri. And so the first one was published actually in English, this one PGM5. It was published in English it was published in 1852. So it meant that basically from 1852, you then all of a sudden had this Greek magical papyrus available in English translation. And the translator, Charles Wycliffe Goodwin, called it a Greco-Egyptian work upon magic. So he did specifically emphasize the Egyptian side of it, even though it was written in Greek. And he also speculated that it was written by or owned by a priest of Isis or Serapis. So these kind of Greco-Egyptian or Egyptian deities. A passage from this was used was then taken, and actually this specific passage, the Stela of Yeo, was actually used in a passage if it was quoted in a work by Wallace Budge, who was an early Egyptologist. He published a section of it in a book called Egyptian Magic. So my impression is that, people in the 19th century are interested in Egyptian magic. They want to try to figure out what it was. They find out that this famous Egyptologist, Wallace Budge, has published a book called Egyptian Magic. And in it, you have this really interesting, something that looks probably closer to what they imagine magic to be, this text, the Book of the Stela of Yeo. And he, of course, references the original edition, which has an English translation, which makes it easier to use. And so it seems that, I think, in the 1890s, I'll have to double check this, Egyptian Magic's published in 1901. So I guess it was in the early 20th century rather than late. Yeah. So it's in the 1900s, basically, the early 1900s. The members of the Golden Dawn begin experimenting with incorporating this into their ritual practice. So, for example, Alan Bennett, who I think was Aleister Crowley's mentor within the Golden Dawn, and it seems that other people, so for example, Florence Farr, were using it. And then it becomes incorporated. This text is used by the Golden Dawn in various different rituals. They use parts of it, sections from it. But then the whole thing is then published in MacGregor Mather's translation of the Goetia. And there's a bit of disagreement about whose decision it was to put it there. I think Crowley claimed it was his own. But one specific change that happens is that, the text has an interesting history, and there's various changes that get made to it over time. One of the first changes that I think either Crowley or Mathers make is to change the headless God into the Bornless God. Now, in Greek, akephalos means headless, and it's quite clear that it refers to a being without a head, although it's not quite clear what that means theologically. But the members of the Golden Dawn, they had smatterings of various ancient languages, and they knew that in Hebrew, the word resh meant head, and apparently it also means beginning. And so they decided that they could do the same thing in Greek. So they see a God without a head doesn't really make much sense, but a God without a beginning makes a lot of sense. And so one of the first things I think you see in the edition that you find in the Guitia is they say, not I invoke you, the headless one, which is the original translation by Goodwin. They change it to I invoke you, the bornless one. So the one who was never born. And then this becomes, I think, one of Crowley's favorite rituals. So first of all, it's in the Guitia. So this is one of the very popular texts in Western esotericism. But Crowley himself uses it very often. Let's see, I'll just try to... Yeah. So for example, the Book of the Law, he received this after receiving a summons when he was in the Great Pyramid. So he was performing a ritual for his wife, and he was called to go to the Bulak Museum. And this is where he sees the stela, which then becomes the inspiration for the Book of the Law. The ritual that he was practicing in the Great Pyramid was actually the Bornless Rite. So it plays quite an important role in, I guess, the creation of Thelema. And then in his various retirements that he went on, he continued to use it. He also continued to adapt it. So, for example, I said earlier on that in the text, you identify yourself as Moses. He decided he didn't really like this. He didn't like this kind of Jewish aspect in it. He wanted it to be more Egyptian. So he changed the name Moses to Anchefen Kons, who is the name of the guy to whom the Stela of Revelation belonged. So it became very popular in Crowley's own practice, but then it had perhaps a side reception, we can say, through Israel Regardie. So Crowley's secretary, Israel Regardie, started publishing a lot of the Golden Dawn materials. One of the interesting things that he did was when he was publishing the Bornless Rite, he went back actually to the original translation by Goodwin. And so I think that in which book is it that he originally published? Is it in A Tree of Life? I think it's A Tree of Life, and then in Ceremonial Magic that he talks about these things. And he specifically actually makes the decision to go back to the original text of Goodwin. So he decides to kind of restore this original text, even though he thinks that Crowley's interpretation is maybe correct, but he still prefers the kind of more authentic translation. And this is perhaps something which I've noticed in the reception of these texts. I think that the kinds of modern occultists who are interested in ancient texts are also interested in kind of getting back to a more authentic version of these texts. And we can perhaps contrast that with a more kind of interpretive or, I guess, self-directed tradition of magic that you see, for example, in chaos magic traditions. And maybe you can see an early sign of that kind of practice when you see Crowley changing the text according to how he thinks it should actually be interpreted. And so, for example, there's more modern grimoires like the Book of Abrasax by Michael Cecatelli. There's Jonathan Stratton Kent wrote a whole pamphlet kind of giving this history, which is one of the first places that I encountered it, called The Headless One. I think there's another one, a third one. There's a book by Damien Licorinos, or a collected volume, which also has a translation of it. And actually, Damien Licorinos is somebody who has done a thesis on modern magicians, and although I haven't read it, I suspect he may have something interesting to say about this. So as we've seen this kind of attempt to go back to original versions, this attempt to kind of constantly go back to scholarship. So in the 1980s, we have the first major English translation of the Magical Papyri led by Hans-Dieter Betz at the University of Chicago. And from that point on, this kind of becomes the main reference point for modern magicians. So the version they're using now, generally speaking, if they're including the Stela of Yao, they're calling it, they're using actually the version from Betz, not the version published by Israel Regardie or the version published by Crowley or the version from the original publication by Goodwin. They're actually using the Betz one. and often they'll kind of talk about this history and the fact that, Aleister Crowley interpreted it as the Bornless God, and it's actually the Headless God. This becomes part of, a way to assert your knowledge of the text. In the discourse, you can say, well, Crowley called it this, and it's often well known this, but its real name, going back to the original sources, is the Headless God. And yeah, I suppose the fact that the Betts volume is now available in English, I think you can even find it for free on the internet if you know where to look. This means that now there's a huge number of ancient magical texts available to modern practitioners. And so I think there's my impression, although once again, I don't really study this in detail, my impression is there's perhaps less of a focus on the Bornless Rite and more of a kind of exploration of the various range of practices. And the Betts PGM is actually Greek Magical Papyri is very helpful in this regard because it gives a lot of footnotes. It gives a lot of explanatory footnotes, which really give you a sense of understanding the text as you go through it. As someone who works on these, I think the footnotes are often wrong, and the translations, to be honest, are often wrong. But I mean, they're not terrible. They're good translations and they're good footnotes. It's just that I often interpret it in a different way, and other scholars may as well. But you can see there's an interesting way in which the modern reception has kind of followed this specific book. And so one thing I noticed recently is there's a practitioner who has a blog in which they talk about their use of the PGM and their attempt to adapt the PGM into modern practices. Of course, the Greek Magical Papyri have a lot of assumed knowledge, which we've lost. And so modern practitioners have to put a lot into it. So often they add things like mudras, or they add in kind of other things which come from, more modern ceremonial magic, which are probably a bit alien, to be honest, and which are nonetheless necessary to kind of fill out the gaps. But one thing I've noticed this practitioner does, so it's actually a German-speaking practitioner based in Germany. He could be using the original translation of the Greek Magical Papyri, which is in German by Karl Preisendans and his collaborators, which has facing Greek text. But instead, it's quite clear when you look at his blog that he's actually using the English Betts edition because it's much more accessible. And you can see that in the specific translation choices that he uses, but also in the way that he interprets the texts. So yeah, this is a huge subject that I think a lot more work needs to be done on. But I suppose what's interesting to me as somebody who works on texts and on textual transmission and reception is the way in which the kind of modern reception has been so much conditioned by scholarship and what's happening in scholarship and the production specifically of translations in English, and then people constantly playing with them on the one hand and adapting them in their own way, but then very often going back to not the original text, but the text in translation and trying to kind of get back to something more authentic. It's kind of interesting tension, which I see in this material.
This is very fascinating to me. I wanted to ask you about this. I was not aware that the original inspiration for the creation of this Rite by the Golden Dawn was this coming from the Theban Magical Library. I wasn't aware of that connection.
Oh, okay, but you knew of the ritual, did you?
Yes, because last year I was talking about this in a podcast episode that I did with two of my colleagues. We were watching a show called Hellier. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you've heard of it. No, it's an American, I guess you could call it a documentary type series. It was of a paranormal group that was following events of high strangeness in the cave systems in Kentucky in the United States.
Wow.
And related to that was another podcast called Penny Royal. It was a separate podcast with a separate creator, but the teams of Hellier and of Penny Royal met each other and realized that they were kind of talking about similar things. Well, in the course of discovery for this paranormal team, they came across a man who was also involved in writing about events of high strangeness, and this person introduced this book that they had written with an account made by a person. We're not quite certain if this person is a real person or if this is an imagined person, but in the book it is put forth as if this is a real person. We don't know if it's fiction or not. But this person was saying that they had to use the Bornless rite to protect themselves against aliens. So we get alien ufology mixed with a high strangeness, and all of these things, kind of develop out of this quest that this paranormal team has to try to to try to find out what's going on with all of these strange events. And
really interesting.
My colleagues and I were very very intrigued by this program, and we started talking about it. But that came up, and I had no idea that this had its origin in an Egyptian magical papyri. So it's really interesting how things come full circle sometimes, where you realize things like that. So that's
one interesting thing I could add, perhaps there is that so a lot of the rituals my understanding is a lot of the rituals of the Golden Dawn early on were kind of about invoking deities, right?
Right.
Which is something you find a lot of in the Greek magical papyri. But Budge didn't include one in his book Egyptian Magic, and so the Golden Dawn didn't actually use one, and so they were using this ritual, which was actually for protection against demons, to invoke. Well, actually, it's a little bit vague, but that's what it's probably for. But there's a lot of non-specific language. But they were using it to invoke deities still, right? Because that was one of their main practices.
Right.
But part of this kind of archaizing tendency has been to return to the original purpose and say, well, actually, this is not an invocatory ritual or an evocatory ritual. It's actually a protective ritual. So that shows that the person this person who was using it to protect themselves from aliens was actually in some ways using it in a more authentic way than Crowley.
Right.
Funnily enough.
Yeah.
So they obviously knew about this original purpose and used it in that way.
Yeah. I just find this all very interesting stuff. And, and how scholarship is actually very important in all of this, to really understand what it is that you're talking about, what you're working with. Yeah. So, and another example of how scholarship can be very relevant. You've recently been featured on a podcast called Apparition Mysteria, which is also kind of a strange coincidence because Appalachian in Kentucky, that's the same area. Apparition Mysteria, Merritt and Karen, WVU co-ed murders, where you were asked to help decipher a copper plate containing what was assumed to be Coptic language, and this copper plate was thought to be connected in some way to this case. And I thought this was a fascinating story. I listened to the podcast, but I'd like you to tell us more about your involvement in this podcast episode, if you would.
Yeah, so I'll try to tell you what I remember of it. So I should say that it's a fantastic podcast, the Co-Ed Murders. If you like podcasts and you're interested in these true crimes, to be honest, I'm not a big fan of true crime, but I listened to the whole podcast and I loved it. So that's my sales pitch for it. So it's called Merritt and Karen WV Co-Ed Murders. It's basically about a couple of girls called Merritt and Karen who disappeared in 1970. And then their bodies were found in the woods, beheaded. So it's quite a horrific case. And one of the things I found the most shocking was not that, it's still unsolved. One of the things I found the most shocking was that it wasn't hard to find possible killers. There were actually too many. There were actually too many people who were committing various kinds of violence and kidnappings and killings, near killings against women in the time. So if you listen to the podcast, it's one of the really shocking things is how violent it was at that time, how dangerous it was. But I actually got contacted by one of the producers. When was it now? Maybe 3 years ago. It was pre-pandemic. So I guess probably would have been 2019. So she had contacted me because there was this copper plate that you mentioned, which was associated with the case. It wasn't, at the time that she contacted me, the relationship wasn't completely certain. If you listen to their podcast, you can get a sense of kind of how they gradually come to understand it better. Mm-hmm. It was actually found, at first they thought it was found in the woods nearby. And there had been a rumor. It's a very interesting case, so you should listen to it. But
yes.
There's a psychic church, basically, that had said that they had received a revelation that Satanists were involved in this murder. This kind of, because the beheading is quite strange. It seems kind of ritualistic. And so there's this idea that Satanists or witches might be involved. And so this plate kind of became part of the investigation. And when they'd contacted me, they thought it had been found in the woods. It actually it actually turned out later on that it hadn't been found in the woods at all. It actually belonged to a girl who was around the same age as the woman who were murdered. I think it had been her private possession, but her father had found it and perhaps contacted the local police because there was this satanic angle on the murders, which is never proven, but it was an angle that was in the minds of people at the time. He contacted the police, who got in touch with the FBI. They examined the plate. They decided that it wasn't really connected, but it had been logged as a piece of evidence in the case. And so that's how the podcast producers encountered it. You can see a picture of it if you go to their website. Part of it's actually blacked out for reasons which I'll explain in a moment. But they thought it was written in Coptic or Greek. An FBI person who, I don't know, looking at it, I got the impression maybe he'd done a semester of Greek or something like that. Tried to read it, and he said it was something about opera. Oh, what were the other things? I think he thought he saw the word Coptic in it, and he thought of the word opera, but he wasn't really sure what it was. The producer, Sarah James McLaughlin, got in contact with me because she thought it was something to do with Coptic magic. She actually recognized there's actually a sator square on it. So there's a sator square in the middle of it, kind of backwards, which in the materialized study wouldn't be very significant. But in modern occultism, I think there's more attention to these kinds of small details, so it may have been significant to the person who produced it. I imagine your listeners probably know what a sator square is, or should I?
Probably just give a brief description of it for those who might not know.
I actually have a little one here that the producer gave to me. It's very nice.
Oh, nice.
I don't know if you can see it.
Yes.
There you are. So basically it contains a series of words which are maybe from Latin whose meaning is not really well known. Sator repotenet opera rotus. And what's interesting about this is that you can read it in multiple directions and it reads exactly the same way. And of course, this is kind of referenced in the film Tenet, right? So the name is the middle bit, Tenet, which can be read backwards and forwards. And then various characters have their names. Well, actually, all of these appear in some way. So it begins in an opera, for example. Yeah. So where was I? So she recognized it was a sator square, so she recognized this as a magic square. The FBI didn't apparently notice the sator square, but I guess they didn't have the internet, so maybe things were a bit more complicated back then doing research. So she Googled Coptic and she Googled magic and she came across my website and she contacted me. And I was on holiday at the time, so I wasn't supposed to be working. But I always find these things, really fascinating. And so I kind of had a look at it and I was like, what on earth is this thing? It didn't look like any kind of magical object that we typically get in materialized study. When I tried to read it as Coptic, I mean, the sator square is obvious, but the rest of it I couldn't read. I couldn't figure out what it was supposed to say. I tried to read it as Greek. I tried reading it as Coptic, and it didn't really make any sense. And so I basically emailed her back and said, I'll maybe think about it and try to figure it out. It looks a bit like a curse tablet, so it's written on metal. I think I originally said, well, it's written on copper. Copper is the metal of Venus, maybe something to do with love, or but who knows, But I was kind of just continuing to stare at it every now and then, and I realized that it wasn't Coptic or Greek. It was a Coptic alphabet, but it's actually just English. But written by somebody who obviously had like some kind of how to write your name in Coptic type thing. Perhaps a little digression. So I'd later discovered, I contacted my colleague Egil Asbrum to ask about this, and actually contacted some people who are in the modern OTO to help me as well. So the use of Coptic actually is something that we find in the Golden Dawn. So Coptic was the most accessible form of the Egyptian language in the 19th century. It was very hard to learn hieroglyphs because they only recently been deciphered. But MacGregor Mathers, for example, claimed to be able to read Coptic because Coptic was a language that had continuously been spoken, and so it's easier to learn. And so within the OTO, there are parts of the ritual, I think, where you do have to write things in Coptic, and you do have to learn Coptic, and you have to say words which are supposedly in Coptic. Although to be honest, when I looked at them, it was clearly didn't really know what they were doing. But so the person who created this, I actually don't know how they which particular alphabetic key they used. I spent a bit of time trying to find ones that might have been available to them. I couldn't find any. The reason I say this is there's some very specific choices which are interesting. I think they're actually quite good choices if you're writing English, but they're not the kind of choices that you would necessarily make without being guided. So, for example, there's the sound ch in choose. If you are kind of thinking about it in English, you write C and H, right? Mm-hmm. But that's something you only really do in English and a few other modern languages. There's actually a Coptic sound, which is ch, but it's a separate letter. And so whoever wrote this knew that. So it's quite clever. And apparently there were a range of alphabets circulating within, for example, the OTO, the Ordo Templar Orientalis. But the published ones I looked at didn't correspond to it. So it's a bit of a mystery to me how this person learned to write in Coptic. So the first thing I noticed was that actually there was a name written at the very top. So it's a woman's name. And that was the very first thing I read. So in the podcast, to protect this woman's identity, we called her Debbie. So basically I read Debbie's name. It has her first name, her middle name, and her last name. So I was very proud of myself when I discovered that. And I emailed the producer straight away to tell her. The next part further down was a bit weirder. It had the word lirpa, in written in Coptic or Greek. It's basically the same letters for lipra. And I didn't really know what it meant, but I noticed there were some little squiggles, like lines and squiggles. And a few years ago, I'd been in a class where we were reading Greek papyri, and one of my colleagues, who's brilliant, her name is Agnes Mihalik, when she studies the Greek liturgy, she'd pointed out that if you counted them, it actually corresponded to things which were being talked about in the text. So it was a document talking about selling various kinds of clothing, and she pointed out there were little squiggles at the bottom that corresponded to the numbers of articles of clothing being mentioned. So kind of inspired by that, I was like, okay, well, I'm just going to count these different squiggles. And I realized it actually gave a date from memory in the 1950s. So if you put them together as numerals, each of the different types of squiggle, it produced a sequence. I later realized there were attempts to write ancient Egyptian numerals. So not the numerals that you would use with Coptic, but whoever uses obviously had access to like how to write numbers in hieroglyphs and had tried to write the number in hieroglyphs. And then that made me realize that lipra, if you read it, or lirpa, if you read it backwards, is April. So it gave a date, and even gave, because the time, it actually has AM in it. I originally read it as ma because it's backwards, but if you flip it, it says AM. So I sent this to Sarah McLaughlin, the editor of the podcast, and she was actually able to track this woman down based on that information. And got in contact with her. So the last part of it, well, actually not quite the last part. So if you go further down in the document, at the very bottom of it, there's a phrase. And once again, it took me a very long time to read. All I had access to was a photocopy made in, I guess, the 1970s. Mm. So I had a scan of a photocopy. So it's really, and this is not, a nicely written document. It's scratchings on a bronze plate.
Right.
But eventually, I realized that it said freedom. I'll just make sure I get this right. Once again, it was written backwards, and it had these kind of surprising choices. And occasionally little spelling mistakes. So freedom to choose personal code of life and happiness. So this is what it says. So it's kind of a slightly surprising self-affirmation, I suppose you could say at the bottom. And there are various other symbols. So one of the things that the producer and I did is we were kind of discussing it back and forth before we got in contact with the woman. And we were like, okay, well, there's a Taurus sign, there's a Venus sign, there's a 6-pointed star. I think I figured that the woman would have been a Taurus from the date. And so I guess this is why there's a Taurus sign. She's a woman, so I guess there's a Venus sign. There's a Rotus cross, which is not something you really find in ancient documents, or a Rota cross, but I think it's mentioned in medieval magic. Then there were a series of other symbols, which, once again, your listeners can look at the document for themselves. I didn't know what they were. The producer was kind of, asking me about it and being like, oh, maybe we could look it up. And I was very skeptical. In ancient documents, we have so many what we call characters. Once again, there's examples behind me. And what we usually say is they don't mean anything. They're just symbols that people make up on the spot for whatever meaning they choose to give them. But I have a little collection of kind of modern occult books, and so I was looking through them. I didn't find anything similar, but there was a dictionary of symbols I had, and so I sent that to her. It's a huge book. It's something like, I don't know, 400 pages. So I sent a PDF of that to her, and I was like, "Oh, you look through it," expecting that she would find nothing, but she actually managed to identify it. So it's actually the sign of Mephistopheles, and we managed to track this down to a specific early modern codex, which was published. It's one of the early codices to be published as in a printed copy in German, in very difficult to read black letter text. But basically, it's a symbol which is supposed to be the name of Mephistopheles. And so this was something, because it was published early, once again, it was then passed on through various, occult sources until it found its way to this dictionary. So once again, the person who wrote this had access to, a Coptic key, an Egyptian numeral writing key, and also, I guess, something which gave the name of Mephistopheles as a character. So eventually, the producer was able to contact the woman who we're calling Debbie, and it turned out that there was a guy who worked in the local kind of occult bookstore, a little bit older than her, kind of a bit of a weirdo in the community, who had produced it for her. Saying that it said her future or something like that. So he kind of produced it for her as kind of like, apparently she had quite a controlling father and she felt like she didn't have much self-control. So I think he kind of created it for her as a little talisman. But she never really knew what it said. And I suppose especially when, the police and the FBI came to her house to ask about it, she probably had a very negative memory of it. That was the story. So, ultimately we discovered through talking to Debbie that it didn't really have anything directly to do with the case. She was almost the same age as them, and I think she remembered vaguely that these murders happening. To me, it was kind of fascinating. And I would like to maybe do a bit of work on this because it's a really interesting example of the way in which, Coptic is just a language and the ancient Egyptian is just a language, and nowadays, Coptic is most often used within the Egyptian Orthodox Church. But for whatever reason, I guess because of our Western ideas about Egypt and specifically because of the Golden Dawn's reception of Egypt, Coptic is now thought of as a kind of magical language or magical script. And so the person who produced this document with all of these strange signs on it and, decided to use Coptic, it's a bit strange, it's like saying to write something in Japanese or something like that,
Right.
It's just a choice. It's just a different language. You're not really saying anything different.
Yeah.
Script, rather. You're not really saying anything different, but it has these associations, which I found quite interesting. And I study Coptic magic. So I guess to me, Coptic is a kind of magic language, but most people who study Coptic, they study letters or they study accounts or they study religious texts. So, yeah. But anyway, interesting.
That was very. I really suggest that everyone go listen to that podcast, especially the episode that you're featured in that explains this story. Also about the man who made the copper plate and how he kind of was a self-taught esotericist, I guess you could call it, or occultist, and so that reflects in the way you see the choices being made in the creation of this copper plate. I just thought it was very, very interesting, and also, like I said before, how relevant scholarship actually is for people. Perhaps maybe a common idea might be that, those people that study all that ancient stuff, what is that really good for, in everyday life? Well, here you have an example of how it can be applied. So I thought that was a great story, and I'm thank you for sharing that. Because you added a few extra details that weren't in the podcast, so I like that.
That. I actually hate listening to my own voice. I listened to that episode, but I can say the other episodes are fantastic, and they have really good guests on the other episodes.
Yes, well, I'm a podcaster myself, and I love listening to other podcasts too. And true crime is one of those areas where I do kind of fall down the rabbit hole sometimes. So,
one other little thing that's interesting, I guess, is throughout a lot of this interview, I've been kind of stressing the way the reception is conditioned by, what's available, right? So the way in which, like the Golden Dawn's reception and then more modern reception has been conditioned by scholarly production. But what's quite interesting in this case is that it kind of goes against my instinct. So I always try to like find where something comes from. But in this case, I couldn't do that. I'd never, this object seems to really be unique. His use of the Coptic script seems to be unique. And so that's a really interesting case of it seemed like somebody really, maybe there were things available to him that I just don't know about. Maybe we could track down like a book that was available in the 60s and in West Virginia, which told you how to make an object like this. But it does really seem, the more I've looked into it, that he just kind of, thought this is what a magic tablet should look like, and this is how I'm going to do it. Which to me is interesting because so often I'm looking at how things are transmitted and copied.
Yes, exactly. How this is, a lot of occultists might, be making their own decisions on the basis of what they've learned themselves, but might not be in the same trend or in the same vein as another occultist might. So they're making their own decisions at that point as to how they create their own magical objects. So very, very interesting stuff. For me. Yeah, right. Now I can imagine that was probably coming out of left field for you, but yeah, interesting. If you do look into that further to see, to do your little detective work, I'd love to hear about it. If you'd send me an email about it, so I can read about that, I would be really appreciate that. In closing, I'd like to mention your own endeavor, the Coptic Magical Papyri podcast. Can you talk a little bit about this project and your goals with it?
So the Coptic Magical Papyri project is kind of the larger project which I run. Our goal was first of all to kind of produce a catalogue of all the Coptic magical texts, which we could. The Coptic magical texts are a lot less well studied and a lot less well known than the Greek and even Demotic ones. So we kind of produced, first of all, an online database of all of the ones which we're able to find. And now we're working on translations, which we're making publicly available on our website, and which we're also hoping to print as a physical copy within the next year or so. And part of this project, so we have a blog, which is a little bit less active now that we're focusing more on translation. We have a blog where you can get more information about this kind of thing. But we also have a podcast, and I can't really take credit for that. It's really the work of Marketa Preininger, who's one of the team members. But from very early on, she was very interested in kind of using a podcast as a way of public outreach. And so the way it works is really a series of interviews with scholars, so really leading scholars on various topics to do with ancient magic. So we have people talking about, some people I've mentioned, so we have Agnes Mihaliko talking about the liturgy and magic. We have, I think Sebastian Richter talks about ancient alchemy and magic. We have a podcast coming up with Joseph Sanzo, where he talks about ancient Jewish and Christian magic. If any of your listeners are interested in hearing what these scholars have to say, I think hopefully they might enjoy it. We're always interested in hearing suggestions for what, other kinds of topics they might like to hear about. As you say, I guess scholarly work is often, it seems a little bit abstract and very separated from the real world. But I think at least what I find what we study very interesting. And so our goal with the podcast is really to try to share this what we think is interesting material with a wider public.
Excellent. And yes, I will include the link to the podcast so people can go listen to it. I think it would be a good idea with the knowledge of what we talked about before, that magic is, the topic itself of magic is not an easy it's not an easy concept to even define. Like I said, it's not a cut and dry thing that you can say one thing about it. No, it is a very complex subject that have many, many different viewpoints, I guess you could say. So that's, excellent place to hear all those different opinions being shared. So, well, Korshi, it was a pleasure to talk with you today and learn more about your area of specialty.
Yeah, thank you very much, Stephanie. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you for taking time out of your day to share this with me, all of this with me. Thank you to the viewers and the listeners out there. And please check out that description box for the links and the resources. Check out the podcasts. I really recommend them. Okay, that's it for now. See you next time. Bye-bye.